right. Lesson today is going to be about Egypt in the Old Testament being a type of the flesh. So if you can, whenever you read the Old Testament, you see when it talks about Egypt, it is talking about the flesh. Now, what is the flesh? The flesh is what the natural man, that is every human being born on the earth, what they can bring to the table. They can bring no more than the flesh. Your mind is also your flesh. Paul talks about don't follow your fleshly mind, the vain imaginations of your fleshly mind. So your fleshly mind is limited to the senses. It can't go beyond that. It cannot know anything spiritual. You can't spiritually comprehend. That's covered in 1 Corinthians 2 or 3 maybe, where it says only the Spirit of God can know the Spirit of God and can reveal the Spirit of God to human beings, that the human cannot understand God at all. He can only stand the senses, the flesh, the fleshly mind. So your mind, body, spirit, it's going to include your attitude. A lot of people have Christian ideals. They think, well, if you have a positive attitude, you're going to be a better Christian. If you're going to be mentally strong, if you're going to have this willpower, it's all things that are of the flesh that they're trying to enlist into spiritual life, but it doesn't do anything. It accomplishes nothing. So we're going to have this example of Egypt in the flesh. So the first time we have Egypt in the entire Bible is from a woman named Hagar. She is Abraham's concubine. Now she is a slave, and she bears him a son, and that son's name is Ishmael. Now we see in the story in Genesis about Ishmael is that he is the firstborn son of Abraham, but he is a child. He's not the child of promise. He's the child of Abraham's willpower. He's going to accomplish God's promises by sleeping with the slave woman and bearing a child instead of waiting on God. So we see this. We're going to have this ideal always in Egypt when it talks about it. It's going to be slavery. You will be a slave to Egypt, or Egypt will be a slave to you. That is, so your flesh, you will be a slave to the flesh, or the flesh will be to the slave to you. Paul covers this also in Romans. So he relates the flesh to sin. He says you're going to be in bondage to something. You're going to be in bondage to the flesh, aka sin, or you'll be in bondage to Christ, aka the Spirit. So this example here. Now, what happens is then Abraham has another son, Isaac, second son. Also, the first son is always a type of the flesh. The first son of the whole Bible. If there's two sons, the first son is the flesh. The second son is the Spirit. So this came about from a miraculous birth, a miracle birth. So the new birth, when you're born again, it's covered in John 3. It says that it's a miraculous thing that God does in you. You don't born yourself naturally, And you can't born yourself spiritually by your mind, your attitude, your anything like that. God has to do that. It's something that happens where you have a spiritual life, a spiritual birth. And so that's what we're going to look at, this the difference between the two. Not really the difference between the two. We're going to be looking at how to this is really saying how to live the Christian life. You don't follow the flesh. You follow in it's all of its supposed strengths. So the second, this is the one that's really pretty cool. Is you have Joseph. Now Joseph was taken to Egypt as a slave, correct? And then he came across the Pharaoh. Who was the king. He sat on the throne. Now, Pharaoh came across this dream, and in this dream he became really terrified of the 7 fat cows, and then 7 skinny cows came up and they ate the fat cows. And he didn't understand the dream. So he found, Joseph came and interpreted the dream for him. And he said there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And then all that famine will take away all the years of plenty, and there'll be famine in the whole world, and you won't even remember those 7 years of plenty. So he said, what Joseph told Pharaoh, what you need to do is gather up, when you have the first 7 years, gather up all your bounty and save it so you can get through the 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh said, who can I find greater than Joseph to do this job? Because he knows the mind of God. He's in tune with God. God speaks to him. I'm going to turn over the whole kingdom to Joseph. So essentially what happens is then we have a reversal. Joseph is essentially now the king. Pharaoh has abdicated the crown. And now as Joseph starts getting the famine starts and he's saved up all this grain, the people of Egypt start coming to him and saying, well, we need food. So give us food and we'll... So what's the first thing? They give them all their gold. The next year comes again. We need food. Gave them all their livestock. Next year comes. We need food. They gave him all his property. The next year came. They didn't have nothing. They said, we will sell ourselves to you, Joseph, as slaves. Now, you see now what happened with this Pharaoh and all of Egypt is they representing the flesh, they put themselves into submission to God, and then God spared them. But they had to be in submission. It's the ideal of being a slave. Now in the book, Paul wrote, and he says, I'm a bond slave to Christ. He says, I've chosen to become in submission to him in the position of a slave. I'm not going to make any decisions. I'm going to depend on him. He's going to be my king, my Lord, and whatever he says goes. I'm abdicating the crown. So that is the position of the Christian. You don't... Well, we'll get to the other guy too. This is even a little clearer. So then you have another Pharaoh. Immediately after that Pharaoh, you have another Pharaoh. And he is coming up against Moses. At this point, what are the children of Israel? They are slaves. And he is the king. And right off the bat it says he is the king, that did not know Joseph. Now, Joseph is a clear representation of Christ. You can look that up anywhere, Google that. I'm not going to go into it, but Joseph is a type of Christ. So he did not know, here is a king that did not know Christ. And it's like every man born in the human, every human born, they've got their natural abilities, and they try to live their life through their natural abilities, and they don't do so good, they fail. And but some are, you have to stubborn, and they say, no, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make it, I don't need God, I don't need Christ. This is where I'm going to rely on my personal physical abilities. Now here you see more clearly that the flesh is not something that's weak about you. The flesh is something that's strong about you. The strongest things you have is what keeps you from the grace of God. You say, well, I can make this. I do the best I can do, and I expect God to do the rest. Well, God don't work that way. He ain't going to do no rest. No, He expects submission. You don't say, well, you'll do it, all of it, and I'll pick up the pieces you can't do. He says, I will not share my glory with any flesh. So you see this Pharaoh he doesn't have weaknesses, he has strengths. He thinks that he has these strengths. So God starts subtracting them one by one, right? The Nile. He fills it full of blood. The Nile is the most important resource that Egypt had. Every year it flooded, and all of that waste material from Africa came down and flooded the plains of Egypt, and it made tremendous crops. They can grow crops like crazy. This was the world's first agricultural civilization, because every year crops. They became rich, they became powerful, and it was all because of this river. So this is his natural resource, the natural resource. So then he started taking away the other natural resources. The animals were destroyed by hail. Same thing as the other Egyptians gave their animals to Joseph. Then the land was infested with all sorts of plagues. Anyway, it was the resources of Egypt slowly started being hammered away. Well, not slowly, pretty quickly. Bam! Started knocking the legs out from under Pharaoh, so he could just say, hey, I'm losing resources. I'm being stubborn. I'm going to say, I can do this on my own. I don't need God. I don't need your God. You can stay away. I'm not going to obey him. I'm not going to get off the throne and submit to Moses, who is now representing God. I won't do that. So his strength is what kept him in power. So finally, his last resource that he lost was what? The firstborn sons of Egypt. He said, they lost that resource. That is, you could say the Nile was the most important resource, but I did. But what's the real important resource of any society? And you hear it all the time. Our children are our greatest resource. They're the ones that are going to keep the society going. They're the ones that are going to, we can rely on when we get older. They'll take care of us. They'll perpetuate our culture. They'll perpetuate our society. Everything we believe in, that's our sons. So he said, okay, I'm taking away that. The firstborn sons of all of Egypt were killed. So slowly, and this is actually what Pharaoh tried to do with the children of Israel. He said, when you have a son, throw him in the water, drown him in the Nile. So God didn't tolerate that. He didn't let it happen. But this did happen to them. So then, in conclusion, what happened after this was Pharaoh got his troops, and they went after Moses and the children of Israel after they'd lost everything. From their most natural resource, the river, the Nile River, to their children, their firstborn sons, they lost all of that. So what happened? They pursued them. They pursued them in their chariots. You should even try to draw a chariot. There's a horse. There's a tail. There's a ears. Okay. Chariots are pursuing them. They cross the Nile. They follow. Not it's the Nile. It's the Red Sea. They cross the Red Sea. Moses is over here. The children of Israel. Moses is over here, and what happens? They drowned. They all drowned in the sea. What saved Moses killed Pharaoh and his army. So what is this representing of? Now we have the story. It's not a story, but it's the. It's called baptism. It's about baptism. What happens in baptism? It says that we go lay down. We are buried in baptism. It's you're dead, supposed to be dead. Buried in baptism, risen when you come up out of the water. This is exactly what happened to Pharaoh's people. The flesh went into the water, they didn't come out. Our flesh, when you become a Christian, this is a symbol, baptism is a symbol that you've given up on the flesh. It's buried, dead. When you bury something, you don't mess with it no more. You don't try to fix it. You don't try to heal it. You don't try to get counseling for it. You don't try to give it a better attitude. You don't say, okay, well, with willpower, I'm no longer going to be a sinner. This is the natural man. This is the sinner. And what you do is when you become a Christian, you count yourself as dead. Paul says, count yourself as dead. Consider yourself dead. We go back to Abraham with Isaac. Now it says that he had Isaac. Now he had Ishmael. That was his attempt to perpetuate his line. But then it says that then he counted himself dead. It says that in Romans 4. Abraham counted himself dead. And when he counted himself dead, he had Isaac. He had a child with Sarah, and he had Isaac. So, counting yourself dead, what that means is he went, I don't have the resources, I don't have the ability, I cannot create this spiritual child, this child of promise, this child that God promised and God would provide. I'm 100 years old, I can't do it anymore, my resources are done. But that's the point that God gave him Isaac, when he counted himself dead. So this whole thing is, if you want a spiritual life, if you want to grow in a spiritual life, you don't try to fix this guy, the flesh. You're supposed to count him dead. Later in Romans 6, This was in Romans 4, where Abraham counted himself dead. In Romans 6, Paul says, count yourself dead. Consider yourself dead. The ideal of death is all through Paul's writings. Take up your cross daily and follow me. Christ's sayings too. If you want to save your life, you will lose it. If you lose your life, lose it. If you lose your life, you will save it. Now we go on to this analogy is continued in Romans 12, which a lot of people don't understand this verse. Romans 12, it says, this is your reasonable service, to lay yourself down on the altar. Well, what do you do when you lay yourself on an altar? You're there to die. You don't get up after you're there for a sacrifice. You're to give that life. You lay it down. I'm not going to no longer depend on the flesh, put my hope in the flesh, trust in the flesh. I'm going to be dead. And then you're going to have spiritual life. That is trusting in the Spirit, trusting in Christ for all of your needs. My God shall supply all my needs according to his riches and glory. But he can't supply all your needs if you are trusting and relying on your willpower, your mind. There's a lot of mind teachers out there, people who say that they are teaching Christian stuff, and it's almost get your mind together, make your mind like a fortress. You know, don't let no evil thoughts in it. Well, good luck with that. It ain't never going to happen. If you have, everything is 90% attitude, and the rest of it's who cares. No, it's not your attitude. It's not your mind. It's not your will. All of these, every human being on earth has these attributes. And if you say that's your strength, you will not be relying on God and Christ and the Spirit. You will be trying to resurrect. You're trying to use this dead man. Now here's a nice example from the Leviticus. The Leviticus, people don't read Leviticus. It is so full of spiritual insight on how to live the Christian life. And here's one of them. It says, if you take a vow of a Nazarene, that's not spelled right, but who cares? If you take the vow of a Nazarene, which was what Christ was, he was a Nazarene. A Nazarene, Christ was a Nazarene from birth. But if you were a Nazarene, you'd take a vow and you'd say, I want to dedicate myself to God completely and wholly. And I won't shave my hair. I won't drink any alcohol. I won't. There's just a bunch of rules they lay down that you cannot do. If you're going to take this vow, you say, I'm going to do this with all my heart. But one thing could make you break your vow. If you touched a dead body, your vow was broken. You had to go back, start all over again. Go ahead and shave your head and start the whole process all over. If you just right next to a dead body, somebody was dead, you touched them accidentally, or somebody was unclean. The unclean is the same thing. The flesh is unclean. Ever notice you got to clean your flesh every day, or it stinketh. You couldn't touch anything. You couldn't eat or touch anything unclean or dead. And this is the exact same thing as that's what the flesh is. If you go back to the flesh, if you're trying to make this vow of the Nazarene, I'm going to follow God, I'm going to commit myself to God. If you're trying to do something with your old nature, your old man, your flesh, you're trying to correct it, you're trying to give it a program, a 10-step program, a 12-step program. You're trying to follow these supposed spirit Christian principles. If you do these and you don't do this and you do this and you don't do that, you are trying to fix the flesh, which the Bible says you cannot change a leopard's stripes. That's what it's saying. This guy is, as they used to say about my grandmother, can't make a silk purse of a sow's ear. It's different material. If you want a spiritual life, you have to commit yourself to the Spirit. Okay, so I hope this can be a revolutionary thing in your life. Completely change your Christian life. 100%. Stop trying to think that God wants to use your strengths, your gifts, natural gifts.